Okay, we're ready to resume and go into session 2.
Our subject this morning now is forecasting for business, and I will just turn it immediately over to Professor McGahan.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak before you today. Such a distinguished panel of professors and visitors to the school. Dean Lateef asked me to speak on behalf of the School of Management on the subject of business forecasting, and I must confess this is a daunting challenge, especially because the agenda for you is to think about a 35 to 200 year horizon. And Maddie, when she engaged me for this talk, suggested 3 questions that were of central interest to you. Who is doing this in business? That is, who is thinking about forecasting over a 35 to 200 year horizon? How are they doing it? And whether this is a useful and legitimate practice. And so I'll speak to each of these points in turn, and you'll see that the answer to the first question in some ways begs the answer to the second and third. Who's doing it? Everyone and no one. Basically, on a 35 to 200 year horizon, forecasting for business is extremely challenging. And in fact, there's a sort of a set of theories regarding the financial structure of publicly traded firms that would suggest that a 35-year horizon is not terribly relevant to current performance. Yet, clearly, the same theory suggests that the financial market value of these firms depends on forecasted cash flow. Now, as I'm suggesting, the sooner cash arrives, the better. But with interest rates low, as they are today, the future's not discounted by as much as it would be otherwise. And clearly, firm survival over a 35-year horizon is central to current value. In fact, this morning, I was opening yesterday's mail this morning, and I received my McKinsey quarterly, which is entirely about value and performance, how firms should be valued. I received this as an alum of McKinsey. It's a monthly, rather a quarterly publication that deals with current topics in business. And there is not a single mention in the 7 or 8 articles in this version of McKinsey Quarterly that involves valuing firms on projections that are more than, say, 8 to 10 years into the future. Okay, so just to give you a sense of things, everyone should care. Executive management should be developing long-term forecasts of firm value based on this kind of perspective, and yet the term of the time horizon for executives certainly is less than 35 years, and so their personal as well as their professional interests typically don't span that kind of period. Yet employees, investors, customers, suppliers, distributors, competitors are all invested in the long-term health of firms. So no one's interested because the best forecasts about the future are already incorporated into securities prices, and what really matters are changes in forecasts. So let me again emphasize what I mean by this. You'll have, I think, a speaker a little later this morning who's going to talk about forecasting for investment. Here there's a point of contact between what I'm discussing and what he's discussing, or he will discuss. The idea here is that in theory, and in fact, in large part in practice, the stock price of a firm ought to incorporate current information about the long-term health of firms. And that what really matters for stock prices is changes in those forecasts. So to make the matters worse, essentially, what I'm saying is that not only is the time horizon so long, 35 to 200 years, not only is the time horizon so long, but the best possible information about what will happen in business in 35 years ought to be already incorporated in the stock price. And if you're interested in stock prices, what really matters are changes in these conditions. So we're looking at second-order effects as opposed to first-order effects and trying to incorporate information about the long-term future into stock valuation, which is what executive management is entrusted to do on behalf of investors. So surprises or news about the long-term future, 35 to 200 years out, are often viewed as pretty rare and unreliable. As a result, most firms do not invest on such a long-term horizon. Now, there are some notable exceptions, particularly in business history. Xerox set up in the 1970s the Palo Alto Research Center, which was charged with envisioning the office of the future on this kind of horizon, 35 years, right? The idea was there would be, innovation occurring in Park that would be implemented into products, commercializable products that would have a long-term future. And in fact, you may have seen such films as The Revenge of the Nerds, in which, there's a profiling of how in the early 70s and mid-70s, Xerox had invented technologies that today are considered leading technologies some 30 years later. Another anomaly, IBM for years has invested in long-term research projects, maintaining a central laboratory, as well as distributed research projects that are designed to develop technologies that have a long-term impact, new products, nanotechnology, and so on, biotech-based computing technology that has, a horizon 35 years plus in the future. AT&T for years and Bell Labs invested in technologies that had this kind of horizon, although, of course, as you know, the Bell Labs, now part of Lucent, now has a very different agenda than it did some years ago. It's hard to find other instances, other examples of companies that directly invested in, technologies, in approaches to business that had a 35-year or longer horizon. These are the three exceptions that I could think of in my preparation for this meeting. The emphasis in most firms is in commercialization as well as in primary research. What we've learned in business over the last 30 years, principally from the examples here, Xerox, IBM, and AT&T, is that primary research that yields new products isn't enough. Xerox is famous. In fact, the movie, I think it's called The Revenge of the Nerds. It's a television movie that was made by public television that chronicled what happened at Xerox early in the 70s, in the mid-70s. Primary research, even research that yields new product development, is insufficient to justify as part of the activity of publicly traded firms. Commercialization is as great a challenge. Successful commercialization of products is as great a challenge as invention itself. And so it's difficult for executive management to justify investing, even in forecasting, more than 35 years out. A challenge for sure. Now, in the interest of not being depressing and sort of negative regarding your agenda, I did my best to try to think of forecasts that are occurring that do make the most sense for business, and then to try to come up with some examples of current activity within firms that might be construed as business forecasting. That is, in the interest of sending a positive message and in affirming the importance of the future, the long-term future, I did my best to come up with some good news here. It's clear that there are technologies, demographic trends, social trends, and so on that are relevant to business cash flows. For example, we all know that in 2012, the baby boom will start to retire, that there will be a coming of age in the future of the baby boom's echo, and that this will have an influence on economic activity. Another example that's of central concern to business, the spread of infectious diseases around the world forecasted to be a major health challenge of the 21st century as HIV, AIDS, and tuberculosis, multi-drug-resistant tuberculosis, even drug-resistant HIV spreads through the large countries of Asia, such as China, Indonesia, Russia, and India, that this will have a fundamental impact on business activity. Again, the issue here is, what does this mean for the commercialization of, let me sort of actually interrupt myself here and say that the central significance of these trends clearly transcends business interest. That is, I want to come clean with you and say that I've been asked to speak about forecasting for business, but I think that forecasting on a 35 to 200-year time horizon has implications that are much more salient for governments and for the interests of the citizenry of the world as a whole that are much that certainly transcend business interests. There's no question about it. But I want to be true to the topic on which I was asked to speak. So let me do that and say that for business, a forecasting challenge is to address how these, what opportunities related to these issues can yield commercializable products and what the dominant models are for commercialization. Had I more time, I would talk about what I mean by a dominant model. Just to give you the intuition, for firms to benefit from commercialized products, they have to find a way to glean profit, and this requires coming up with a way of doing business that is win-win for every constituency in the business environment. Okay, and so we tend to think of dominant models that that create these win-win outcomes for consumers, for employees, for all the constituents that I named in the prior slide. Examples of this would be the hub and spoke model for overnight letter delivery, or the eBay model. I'll call it the eBay model for conducting online auctions in which seller legitimacy is validated through the experience of buyers. You know, you accumulate a track record and so on. I say win-win. This tends to be win-win on the horizon of business, that is on a short-term 5 to 10-year horizon, as opposed to the kind of horizon necessary to understand infectious disease and the retirement of the baby boom. So again, I'm trying to speak to the topic that you've asked me to address, which is business forecasting. And the issue here is, what are the likely dominant models for successful commercialization of technologies that are relevant to these long-term trends? This is going to mean, for business, forecasting what, for example, what drugs might be developed to treat multi-drug resistant HIV, and how we're going to, develop retirement plans that are available through financial institutions for addressing the retirement of the baby boomer, financing the education of the children of the baby boomers. Okay? It's very, very difficult for me to envision a forecasting model that could accurately describe which firms would benefit from research that yields commercializable technology 35 to 200 years out. Very difficult to predict which ones from today's field will survive to be leaders in the environment or in the 35 to 200 year future. We know that from business history that the firms that are likely to be leaders on that kind of time horizon are around today. It's just impossible to pick which in the field will be tomorrow's leaders. Some stylized facts that relate to this question of business forecasting. The shadow of the past is long. We know that automobiles today look like they do because they were originally based on the designs of the buggies that they replaced. That is, there's a whole sense of social imprinting into the future that has a pervasive impact on business. Another example, I'm an email addict, as I suspect many of you are, and have you noticed in Microsoft Outlook, when you get new mail, the little thing that comes down in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen looks like a postal letter. I mean, the whole way we conceive of communication on email is based on the postal model. And so there's a social imprinting on the future that's pervasive, that reflects the history of commercial exchange. Predicting it is very difficult. Another example, theater and television. You may remember the Ed Sullivan show used to open with a parting of curtains on the television, again, reflecting the history of imprinting from theater. Difficult to predict which technologies from among the field will dominate. And I have some examples for you, but in the interest of time, let me move forward here, except to say that in one example that I had developed for you, electric cars, we see many fits and starts. Fuel cell technologies have been disappointing for business. Companies like Ford that were quite forward-thinking and sponsoring innovation in small companies like Ballard that were developing fuel cells are finding it hard to continue to justify this in the current business environment, this kind of investment because it's so risky and so hard to manage. Even more difficult to predict which firms will survive and flourish. Who knew that Amazon, I remember having supper with a woman in Palo Alto, California. I can't even remember her name, except I'm ashamed to say we were in a group of friends having dinner in Palo Alto. I was at Stanford, on leave at Stanford at the time. She was saying that she was the director of development for this little outfit called Amazon.com, and I thought, the poor thing, you know, she has an MBA, she's not, she's trying to survive on stock options. It was 1996, you know. She was an MBA that had taken this lowbrow job running a strategy for Amazon.com, and I thought, you know, she's really mortgaging her future. Nothing will come of it. It'll be a disaster. And of course, you know, I'm sure she's sitting. She remembers. She probably has forgotten the dinner completely. You know, she certainly has no idea who I am. It's very difficult to predict which of these small organizations that are among us out there now will be leaders in the future, much less how they could forecast successfully. Who knew that NTT, the national phone company of Japan, would be the fantastic innovator on wireless technology in Asia, almost despite itself. NTT DoCoMo spun out of the main part of NTT because the engineers and the people working there were viewed as you know, kind of upstarts, outcasts, and they come up with this model, DoCoMo, that turns out to be the world's new approach to wireless telephony. 8-tracks versus cassettes. You know, how many of us still have our old Johnny Mathis 8-track tapes gathering dust in the attic? Very difficult to predict which of these business models will dominate, and even more difficult to predict which firms will survive and flourish. Nokia, originally, you know, a timber company. Now, of course, as you know, a leader in wireless telephony. I keep going for the wrong computer. So how are those that are trying to think about the future actually doing business forecasting? You know, I can think of, I've already mentioned pharmaceuticals. I can think of small constellations of business leaders in pharma, computing, and energy that are thinking about the long-term future of technology. Pretty hard to call that forecasting, though. You know, you're asking me to think with you about forecasting. Long-range planning, it's easier to think of this as long-range planning. These folks are generally viewed as theorists, academics, blue sky people that are not, if they're mainstream, it's not because of this effort. Demographic trends, you know, you can find advertising executives, media executives that think about demographic trends in creative industries, financial specialists worried about the baby boom. You want to call those business forecasters? I don't think they think of themselves as forecasters, and yet, at least in some measure, they're thinking about a 35-year horizon. Healthcare, education, third world development, environment, and energy. These are all areas of business activity. I just this morning was on the phone with a friend who's working on, as most of us do, I try always to do some service in my life, and I'm working right now with a small charity that is concerned about healthcare delivery in third world, resource-poor settings. It's called Partners in Health. It's run by a wonderful person named Ophelia Dahl, who collaborates with physicians such as Paul Farmer at the Brigham and Women's Hospital and Harvard Medical School to bring first world technologies into these resource-poor settings. But it's pretty hard to find business firms that can think that are structured in a way that allows them to support the development of new drugs and new technologies on the kind of scale necessary to address healthcare challenges in these third world countries on the kind of time horizon that you're interested in. So you can find pockets of activity, but it's hard to think of a structured efforts occurring in the business environment on this kind of time horizon. I don't endorse this. I don't think it's right, but it's part of the structure of the way business works today that this happens. Generalists tend to focus on dominant models for commercialization. There are business academics out there thinking about how commercialization will occur along these lines of dominant models. For example, there are many of us thinking about what the subcontracting of a lot of IT to Southeast Asia will mean, and Asia in general, will mean for the development of new capabilities in business firms in the United States around IT. Some of these trends are likely to have impact over a 35-plus year time horizon. So there are some of us concerned about this. There are historians in business schools that examine broad trends on how transactions are occurred, dealing with the problem of the commons and public policy implications for business, regulatory issues. But boy, a lot of the work we do reflects our industry life cycle models. Industry life cycles tend to unfold over long periods of time, on the order of decades. For example, in the automobile manufacturing industry, you can see how the life cycle has evolved over a 40-year period in this chart. Here's a model of the industry life cycle in the pharmaceutical industry, again, over a 50-year period. So we think about these issues, and think about disruptions to industry life cycles, phases of architectural change in industries. I want to watch the time here and begin to wind down. So there are upstarts among us that are trying to address these issues, but gee, it's really difficult to get business people to focus on this kind of time horizon and invest for it. This chart shows the phases of architectural change in an industry, such as the kind of transformation occurring now in, say, I mentioned overnight letter delivery. Most of my students, let me give you an example of how this model might work. Most of my students, when I survey them, will agree with me that in 200 years we will not be sending our urgent documents by overnight letter, that is, by Federal Express. They agree with me that secure encryption technology on the internet will be sophisticated enough on a 200-year horizon that we don't have to, put them in those our documents in those cardboard envelopes and drop them off in the mail slot outside on Commonwealth Avenue. Most of them would agree that the time horizon for this transformation is even shorter than 200 years, that it's sort of on the order of, say, 30 years, or maybe 20, or some of them even think 10. What we know from business history is that these transformations along the lines I've just described take a lot longer to unfold than we initially predict. I'd bet it's 25 years before Federal Express stops carrying overnight letters. Now, if you're running Federal Express, you might be thinking about this now. That is, you might be thinking about how a new industry, an emerging industry, in particular the emergence of secure encryption technology, might have an impact on your industry. The established industry here would be overnight letter delivery, right? But the phase here, the established industry here is still growing. We're in the early phases of this transformation. It could take, I bet you it takes 25, let's get back together in 25 years. And I'll bet that we still have overnight letter delivery as an option available to us. You might disagree. My students think it's going to take less time. But we know. But you see, this is a model from my book that I just wrote. Gee whiz, it's an uphill battle to try to convince firms that it's going to take 25 years for this kind of thing to take hold. Yet history shows it's true, right? So, I feel like I'm trying to tell them to do forecasting on this horizon. So we're in the same camp. But they don't believe me. So it's not my fault that they're not doing it. All right, it just to drive the point home here, this is wireless and wireline telephony, represented by these two lines. It shows the time horizon here, just 6 years, 1995 through the end of the year 2000. And the vertical axis here represents average residential toll calling in minutes. And you can see here that we're now using our cell phones to make more phone calls than more toll calls than we're using our landline phones. Every month when the bill comes in on our landline phone, in our family, we wonder, gee whiz, do we really need this old landline phone? We're using our cell phones for everything. And we still keep it because we want it for emergencies and things like that. And sometimes a phone call will come in. but it's a lot less than it used to be. Remember, we used to not have email and use the phone all the time. I'm sure many of you have the same feelings that we do in our household. Gee whiz, when's going to be the time we cut this off? Because it's $50 a month, you know. Anyway, the world is thinking this way. So the final question that your leadership asked me to address is forecasting over a 35 to 200-year horizon useful and legitimate? People like me, business academics, would say yes and no. Forecasting is essential to value and essential to survival. It motivates innovation. You know, forecasting motivates innovation, but forecasting accurately is very difficult for business. There are some industries in which technological, demographic, social, and other trends are critical, and where this practice of long-term forecasting is more relevant and more, perhaps I might even use the word more legitimate, to borrow her language here. On the other hand, most business people would say no. You know, innovation depends on flexibility. Keep in mind that most companies don't live that long. Americans, you know, I saw statistics, Americans move on average every 6 years to take new jobs. Executive horizons are not on a 35-year, 35-plus year term. It takes yet it takes a long time to change a corporate culture. Flexible innovation, very difficult to predict. But forecasting and coming up with surprises is essential to creating value, and sometimes that does require a long horizon. Thanks for your kind attention. Let me turn back to our moderator.
Thank you, Professor. Zachary Karabell is the responder.
Would you like me to Maddie, would you like me to put up the blue screen, or is this all right?
Yeah, I think that would be good for the video.
Is this okay?
Okay.
I like blue screens. It makes me feel like I'm acting in a special effects movie. It was good. I had no idea what Anita was going to say, and that put the onus on me to hone my skills of nearer-term forecasting. I want to pick up on the last slide, because I think the thing from my perspective that's most vital about all of this is incentives. There are very different incentive structures for theorists or for academics or for writers than there are for people involved in business. And being someone who's schizophrenically involved in both, you know, I can speak to both of those to some degree. As a theorist, the onus is really on being credible, provocative, interesting, touching some chord in the present that leads people to feel like that makes sense in the future. In business, none of that really matters much. So on some of the points you raised, I mean, when we do stock analysis on a business, the furthest out we go with a discounted free cash flow model, you know, the present value of future cash is 5 years. And when it's beyond 5 years, it's lots of question marks. Because then you're just speculating. And the last thing people whose money you manage want you to do with that money is speculate. Now, the incentive structure for an individual doing business, an individual entrepreneur, someone with a vision for the future, are also very different than the incentives for a company doing business answerable to shareholders. So a company doing business answerable to shareholders is lucky if quarterly forecasts are not too long-term. You know, Dell, one of the most successful businesses in the country, is all about quarterly numbers. And if you're a salesperson in the bottom 20% who does not make your quarterly numbers for a year, you're fired. Now, you could be a brilliant salesman, and you could say, you know what, I have a really good sense that in about 30 years, what I'm selling, everybody's going to want. And Michael Dell might even bring you into his office if you had been particularly good and he was particularly bored that day, and say, you know what, I believe in you, I'm going to invest in you, but you're fired. Because the incentives for Michael Dell thinking about business going forward in his own entrepreneurial sense are very different than what that organization demands. long-term thinking for the individual with a conception of the future has repeatedly been shown to be highly profitable occasionally for people who get it right. I think the person who funded the Center, I mean, is an example of somebody who thought about that. James Michaels, the former editor of Forbes, once said, look, if you had been around in 1915 or 1920 and you wanted to make the best investment, business investment for the future, what would it have been? Anyone have a guess what his answer to that was? I mean, if you were thinking in 1920 of like the best business to be in for the future, what would it have been?
When did he say this?
Oh, like a year ago. I mean, this is just one of his people, and there were some people who got this right.
Banking.
Banking. What else was going on in the United States in 1920 that you would thought you'd invest in? Coca-Cola.
Liquor.
Liquor, because of Prohibition. A lot of people said automobiles. He said, actually, the thing you would have invested in would have been farmland, unused farmland outside of urban areas in the United States. Because you wouldn't have known which car company was going to succeed, and you wouldn't have known which tire company was going to succeed. But the aggregate effect of all of these car companies plus the Interstate Highway Act would have meant that at 35 to 40 years later, you would have been sitting on the most lucrative business decision you could have made. Now, convincing any business to have done that in 1920 would have been impossible. So again, the incentive structures for an individual for doing business and for businesses are very different. I think the best we can hope for, now, for instance, I was talking to Ian about this actually coming up. If you were investing in business, real estate in the present, buy up a lot of buildings, in Red Hook or outer Brooklyn or, go around 20 miles outside of Bakersfield or something, I don't know, something like that. China investing in West Africa is probably a long-range thinking on the part of a country doing business, and some people will talk about this politically. I think the only mix of this, if you're thinking about how you can get business forecasting into businesses, I don't see any reasonable horizon whereby long-term thinking per se becomes part of a business strategy, because there are too many factors mitigating against that. If we could get businesses to think in terms of 5 years, that would be an accomplishment. One thing you could do, though, the problem, and I think Murray Gell-Mann pointed this the other day, when you have people who are dedicated to thinking about the future in an organization, they often have very fun jobs, and they're often very quirky people, but the organization usually hates them or doesn't respect them because they don't add any value. Why are these people being paid to sit around and think about the future when I've got to meet my quarterly numbers? But what you can do is, if you've got a group of people who are thinking in these long range, who bring in academic knowledge at its best, academic in its good form, not academic in its obscurantism form. And the things that they point to help individuals within a corporate culture think more clearly about the implications of the business as it's currently construed, such that they make adjustments that lead the business to continue to be more successful. Then you can show that there's some value add. Meaning the value these people add is not that they are proven right or wrong, whoever's around 35 years later. It's, does that long-range thinking, you pointed to this in your final slide, help that organization make better decisions in the present that are then testable because they're more successful quarterly or yearly or bi-yearly. I think that is clearly possible as an incentive structure. It's very rare that organizations do this. It's usually a bunch of people sitting off who can think great things, and then there's other people who are nitty-gritty and down in the trenches. But these are, I think, really important things to think about, particularly in a business context, that the incentive structures don't favor it, and that it's very different to think long-term if you're an individual entrepreneur thinking about your own business and a corporate institution thinking about its ongoing business flow. So, them's my thoughts, and I'm sticking to them. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Karabell. Presider's prerogative, I guess, if I could just ask a quick question. You mentioned the business, there's an inherent felt need to surprise or to have to build in an element of surprise in business, in organizing new products and so on. it seems to me that there is human nature that people simply know that life itself is full of stunning surprises. Proudhon had a line saying, "The fecundity of the unexpected far exceeds the prudence of statesmen." And I believe that it is human nature to mistrust long-term planning of any kind for precisely this reason, and particularly in business, where I suspect there is this fear of that long-term planning may indeed become a kind of prison and become a sort of a Soviet model or some such thing, where you have organized yourself around a long-term plan that then becomes difficult to fulfill or obsolete or irrelevant or some such thing. Can you think of any examples where businesses became imprisoned by their own long-term planning and were damaged by it because of the damage to their spontaneity of response and adaptability?
I can certainly think of examples of firms that made plans that, again, to cut to the chase and be clear in my language, they made plans that were wrong. That is, they adopted the wrong strategy and it didn't work, and they were committed to it, and they therefore failed. I can think of examples of firms that had the wrong strategy.
Yeah.
That is,
you go down a certain road and you find it.
How about Woolworths department stores? Remember when I was a kid, we used to go to Woolworths and buy our Halloween costumes and T-shirts and socks and pencils and pens. You remember these chain of retail stores lost proximity on quality. The place became kind of if I can be colloquial, kind of a little cheesy at the end without much on the shelves, and they went out of business. You can come up with many examples of companies that basically failed to survive because they were committed to an approach that turned out not to be tenable in their competitive environments. It's hard, though, for me to think of a company that stuck to a plan on such a long-term horizon, that has developed a 35-year plan, stuck to a plan for that long a period of time, and then subsequently failed.
David?
There are products that have long lead times, and those necessarily embody a certain kind of prediction. Weapon systems, automobiles, which are designed
5 to 7 years.
So, what is that being a particular kind of prediction, a prediction that's built in what you're starting to create today? Is 6 or 7 years about the furthest into the future that such predictions go?
Right. I meant to allude to these kinds of industries in my discussion when I referred to several sectors where there is planning on that kind of horizon. In pharmaceutical firms, energy firms that are thinking about extracting oil from the ground, they think there are individuals within these firms that do think on, say, a 6 or even 10 or 15-year time horizon about, for example, oil exploration efforts around the world that might yield reserves that will have commercial value, that will yield profit on a longer time horizon. However, as my colleague has suggested, these guys are often not viewed as central to the efforts of the firms, except in a few exceptional contexts, such as pharma, where research efforts really are central to the profits of the firm. It's hard to think of instances in which the horizon's longer than 10 years.
Who has the mic? Go for it. No, you go ahead first.
Okay. my sort of, you know, I have to admit that I know nothing about what you're talking about, but my initial reaction to it is that it's very sort of U.S. based.
Really?
Well, the reason is because my concerns have been much more to do with development, which is a longer term process. And one of the interesting historical experiences of history, of course, is East Asia, which is where I am from. And so now there are businesses in Korea, for example, or now Malaysia, do think perhaps a little bit more long term in terms of, well, you know, sort of the last 30 years of development of East Asia had to do with these countries going into sectors that nobody thought they would go into. My own country started producing automobiles that nobody thought in 1950 that we would produce. But this was not some sort of an accident, maybe. There was a sort of a long-term thinking behind it that involved both government and industry.
A great example of that
Korea.
Media in Japan, working
Right,
with
exactly.
the Japanese
yeah.
firms.
And Korea and steel industry. And developing countries are trying to do this all the time, thinking more in the long term, and then getting you know, incentives to businesses to get into these sectors. Now, I mean, some of those have succeeded, as in East Asia, and some things have maybe failed, like in Latin America and in Africa. But so how does that sort of historical experience fit into what you were saying?
Sure. Let me, if I may just say a word on this, and perhaps you might have a thought as well. Let me stick to my story, too, to use your language, and say that I think the points that I made actually are equally applicable to businesses around the world as to U.S. businesses. Although I would also agree that, I hate to generalize, it's so dangerous, but I would agree that the business culture in the United States is particularly oriented toward short-term financial results right now. Right now. Ironically, historically, that was not always true. For example, the development of the railroads in the 1850s and 60s, as my friend and colleague Al Chandler has documented, was based on a much longer time horizon than, say, 10 years. Anyway, while I agree with you that collaborative partnerships between government and industry are pervasive in the countries you and in the regions that you cited, I would also argue that a certain kind of collaboration between industry and government has been very relevant to the success of U.S. firms. Perhaps we could have a whole nother conference on that issue. In every instance, however, I would say that business has to be dragged forward into thinking on a 35-year time horizon. It's very difficult, for example, to get mining firms in Australia to consider the consequences of the 35-year plus consequences on the environment of their activities. I recently returned from Australia, and I'm about to leave for China in the next few days. And while there, I learned about some instances of I read about this place, or saw some pictures in the paper about this place in southeast in China where the pollution due to coal mining is so pervasive that people are moving away from the town. And I can't remember the name of it. Do you know the name of it? Yeah, it's incredible to consider the long-term health consequences associated with this business activity. My experience, and certainly in our culture, business firms have to be dragged forward, kicking and screaming, by organizations like MIDI and others to consider the long-term implications of their policies for even their own survival.
Just to echo that, I would actually disagree with the idea of that being a U.S.-centric. This is not talking about long-range planning at a governmental level, and I guess we'll have quite a bit of the conference will deal with that. certainly businesses in China, or the reasons for the development of the Japanese auto industry, was a perception of there being a domestic demand that someone wanted to meet in the near term. That doesn't mean that, I mean, most businesses are founded on the incorrect assumption that people will always want what it is we do. They're also founded on the correct assumption that at such a point as they don't, it's somewhat easier for businesses, even extremely large businesses, to adapt to that than it is for governments or societies. Largely because you can fire people, except in Germany. They are just more adaptable, even when they're lumbering, than governments are. They just don't have the same level of So businesses tend to be idealistically long-term, and they're thinking that, you know, there's always a market, but they are more adaptable. And I think to some degree they don't always have to be long-term in that sense.
Before I make my point, is sometimes if you build it, they do come. The chia pet, right? Bottle and water. I want to meet the guy who said, I'll put water that you can drink from the tap into a bottle and sell it to people and they'll buy it, right? How did that meeting go? Is what I've always wondered. But I want to make two quick points. Not disagreeing, but wondering if there's a nuance to what you said. And maybe you took Maddie too seriously. Sorry, Maddie. In three ways. First, in the 35 years. And maybe if I was right in the morning, maybe long-term means something else to business, which is not 35 years. And where there are businesses that do think 10 years, and maybe it's just what long-term is. The second is, maybe you took us too seriously in what most business does. Because most policymakers do not look at long-term, most politicians do not look at long-terms, most academics don't look at long-terms. I'm sure most business doesn't look at long-term. Long-term is not a retail market in that sense. The third way, just by positing a proposition, is maybe we also need to be nuanced about what success means. So a business can invest in long-term strategic planning and not succeed as a business, but the strategic planning succeeds. Xerox is a wonderful example, right? They thought paper was going to go out of business. But what they created at PARC created the whole industry, and Apple and the mouse looks like what it does, even though Xerox didn't get into it. So there could still be success without and I wonder whether we need to sort of think differently about the business thing. But as I end, I wanted to throw two interesting examples of businesses. There might be a certain type of business that does do something. I'm afraid of Ralph sitting here because he's going to tell me I'm wrong. But the British East India Company, when it ran the world, and it literally ran the world, Microsoft into 20. It had a flag of its own. The current flag of Hawaii used to be the British East India Company flag. Set up a school in England. I forget the name. It's in Sussex. It still exists. And appointed as the first principal a gentleman by the name of Reverend Thomas Malthus. And the purpose of the school and the charge given to Malthus, and this is what then later led to his sort of demographic hallucinations, but was to make an inventory of the earth. This was the first McKinsey of the earth. He'd figured out the earth is round. Where are the business opportunities? Amongst the people they funded to think about where the future was were Charles Darwin, on one of his earliest voyages, Adam Smith, which is why Adam Smith's book is entirely full of British East India Company stuff. He did this consulting report, and then he just put it into his book. That's what we all did. The current example is Microsoft. I was at a meeting late last year where Microsoft, I'll just end with this very quickly. Microsoft gathers, and Bill Gates comes to the rooms himself, stays there for about 3 hours. Academics and sort of various peoples, business people from all over Asia, to think about what the Asian environment is going to be in the real long term. One of the questions he asked is, are India and Pakistan going to unite? And my answer was, that's a stupid question. It really is a stupid question, right? I'm Pakistani, so. But it's a long-term question. It's a long-term question. It's a question that an organization like Microsoft can and does think about.
No. Thank you for your thoughtful comments. The only observation I'd make, besides agreeing with you that I probably got it wrong, is in terms of what you all were interested in, and I apologize, is the only observation I'd offer is that there are many issues that are that are relevant to forecasting related to business. That is, innovations by companies and so on, like innovations by companies like Xerox, that you might construe as successful innovations. It's just that the agenda that I was perhaps incorrectly asked to speak, or I perceived I was incorrectly was asked to speak about, was on the process of forecasting within businesses. That is, can I speak about how businesses do forecasting on a time horizon of 35 years plus, and it's hard to think of them. So the East India Company may have engaged in philanthropic activity or perhaps even instrumental activity by setting up this school in Britain for its employees. But it's hard for me to imagine that whoever set up that school forecasted that Charles Darwin would come up with, the insights that he came up with. That is, it's easy to think of examples of businesses, including Bill Gates himself with the Gates Foundation, that will seed innovation, but on a long horizon, but often not with accurate forecasting, and often not in the interest of commercial return. That is, the Gates Foundation is not looking to make Microsoft's profit higher by virtue of these investments. Gates himself, I think, has said quite eloquently that the Gates Foundation's objectives are not to promote Microsoft.
Thank you very much. I think we have I'm sorry, Ralph, we're running awfully late. So we'll have a 5-minute break, I believe.
Actually, this is a 15-minute break.
Oh, 15.
And I'm informed there is coffee in the dining room.
Should we let Ralph have his one question, though? Because he didn't have it the first time, so.
No, I just one observation, Anita, which is, why is it in your whole presentation, you spoke about elements that go into success long term, why is it you never mentioned a word about leadership? It seems to me that the essential ingredient in thinking, forward thinking, in terms of planning, is our leaders who think that way. And you didn't mention that really. I think Zach touched on it by talking about incentives. But there are corporations which create a culture of leadership. Yeah. And perhaps that's a very important element that should be addressed in going forward, rather than where they invested so much and so on.
Perhaps I can confess to you that I found this request to speak about forecasting in business quite uncomfortable. Because the answer is there's not enough of it. And there's not, my own work, the reason that our dean, Lou Lateef, asked me to come and speak before you and represent the School of Management is because I've just written this book which calls for better forecasting along a sort of a decades plus horizons. So the issue that I was asked to speak about was forecasting in business and when it occurs. You no doubt heard me sort of and perhaps would endorse my observation that this is often occurring in outside formal forecasting organizations, that you have these pockets of individuals within corporations. I would absolutely feel comfortable thinking of them as leaders, yet they're not respected contemporaneously by their colleagues. They're viewed as costing money, and so it's challenging to find examples of organizations in the current business environment where leaders with the kind of foresight necessary to innovate on a 35-year plus horizon are contemporaneously respected and followed.
Aren't there corporations that create a kind of culture of leadership?
I'm saying I can't think of very many.
And furthermore, you can only do that so much because you can't eat and bank your forecasts on the future. So you can create a culture of innovation. And the East India Company, I suppose, one thing on that, history is speeding up. A 30-year horizon for the East India Company is a 5-year horizon for a company today. It's probably more compressed than that. So there's only so much you can do. Bill Gates, once a year, having made $60 billion, can, at his leisure, bring in a group of Illuminatis from the world who will all show up, and he can speculate about whatever number of stupid or intelligent questions he wishes to. But he can't run a business on its basis. So I think that's part of the rub.
Thank you very much. We'll break now for 10 minutes.
Thank you for your comments.